Hey, welcome back. This is the third and final segment of our relatively short emotion and motivation chapter with a little bit of eating thrown in there as well. So let's get right to the emotion part of the lecture. So this is a very interesting psychologist named Paul Ekman. And if the images look a little bit odd to you, that's because they are. He's actually photoshopped his face into these pictures. And it's the same face, but with different body expressions. The interesting thing about Ekman is that he trained his facial muscles in the 1960s. He trained all of his facial muscles to produce all of the most common emotional expressions. There are 6. And there are hundreds of muscles in the face, and he trained all of those muscles to perfectly represent the emotional expressions that are common really around the world. There's been an enormous amount of cross-cultural research that Ekman has done, and you really see the same facial expressions all around the world. What's interesting here is that the facial expression is identical, but we experience, we would probably guess the emotion a little bit different. We might say sadness here, but here we might say something like fear, maybe anger, something like that. So emotions are feelings that involve 3 different components, 3 major components. Number 1, there's a physical response. Number 2, there are changes in thoughts and behavior. And number 3, there's a personal evaluation or a subjective experience. So if we're feeling sad, the physical response, sadness feels heavy. Anger feels energizing. Happiness and joy feels light and exuberant. With anger, we say we get hot under the collar because we do physically get hotter. The heart might start to race fast. There are also changes in our thoughts and behavior. So we might kind of slump over, or we might put our hands up and say, "Get away from me." And then there's the personal experience of it. What are we actually experiencing on the inside? So there are 2 types of emotions, and I want you to be familiar with both. There are primary emotions, sometimes also called basic. And then there are secondary emotions, sometimes called complex. The primary emotions are evolutionarily adaptive. They are shared across cultures, and they're associated with specific physical states. They are found in all cultures. They have evolved over time because they're useful, and they're associated with specific physical states. The secondary emotions are blends of the primaries, okay? So let's take a little bit closer look. So the primary emotions, sometimes people will say there are 5, sometimes they'll say 6, sometimes 7. We'll use these 5, fear, anger, sadness, disgust, and happiness. Sometimes you'll also get surprise and contempt. And these, again, are basic. They are found in all cultures, and they are evolutionarily adaptive. The secondary emotions are complex emotions that are blends of these. So we might say remorse, or guilt, or shame, or anticipation, embarrassment. Those are secondary emotions. All right. So let me just say a couple more things about this, just from a personal perspective. Emotions are information. They are very useful. Fear tells us, get away from that thing, it could hurt you. Anger tells us something was unjust and we should fix it. Sadness tells us that there's a loss that we should mourn. Disgust tells us that something is contaminated and can hurt us. And happiness tells us this is lovely, do more of that. Okay? They're very informative. Now, at the same time, they can mislead us. Have you ever been afraid of something you shouldn't be afraid of? Were you ever afraid to go on a roller coaster? You knew you were perfectly safe, but you were afraid, right? Or you were watching a movie and you felt afraid. Or you were anxious about a test. You were scared of going up to somebody and asking them out. Sometimes our emotions are deceiving, but sometimes they're very, very informative. Okay, can we alter our emotions through how we behave? Does how we behave influence our emotions? Your book has some information about, I think, about Canon Bard and James Lang theory, and I've quit going over that in my Gen Psych classes because I think it's a little too much. But I think that this facial feedback hypothesis is really important. It provides support for the James Lang theory, which says that how we behave can influence our emotions. So try this. Try holding a pencil between your teeth. Okay, I'll use my pen. When I do that, my mouth turns up almost as though I'm smiling. But then if I hold it between my lips, I can't because it's too heavy. But if I held it between my lips would actually go down almost like a frown. And what they find is that they'll tell people to hold a pen between their teeth, and people will then report feeling relatively happy. They'll report feeling happier than baseline, and they'll definitely report feeling happier than these people who tend to report higher levels of sadness. So nothing has happened in the study to cause happiness or sadness other than the person put a pen between the teeth or the lips. So it's like our face, if we make ourselves smile, it actually causes us to have an improved mood. Now, I was one of those kids who didn't smile a lot. I got told all the time, Kathy, smile. Drove me up a wall. I felt like, am I a lunatic? I'm going to sit around smiling for no reason. But over time, I have really come to appreciate this. So I would say to you, if you're ever feeling down, try smiling and just see what happens. I was reading, I'm doing a book club with my staff, and we're doing the classic old book by Dale Carnegie called How to Win Friends and Influence People. And I just read a chapter where he advises smiling. He says that will get you very, very far. And when I think back, if I'd heard that when I was 20, I would have been like, that's so stupid. But now, 30 years later than that, I think that is exactly right. If I could smile more, I'd be happier and might have more friends and influence more people that way. So Carnegie was onto something. That is, in fact, the facial feedback hypothesis. All right, let's think about expression of emotion. So again, here's Paul Ekman, and he's smiling, right? Can you tell which one is a real smile? I assume that you can. And that's because there's more going on here. This is obviously the real smile. This is a fake smile. You can see more crinkling around the eyes. You can see a little bit more creasing right here and right here. We just know that this is a real smile, and we know that that's a fake one. We can tell instantly, right? So Darwin asserted in the late 1800s that human emotional expressions are innate and culturally universal. Ekman estimates that the human face is capable of creating more than 7,000 different facial expressions, and he himself is capable of producing quite a bit of those because he trained himself. Each basic emotion, remember there's 5, maybe 6, is associated with a unique facial expression. These expressions are innate and hardwired. In fact, the spontaneous facial expressions of children and young adults who were born blind and have never seen a smile or a frown or an angry face or a fearful face make the same facial expressions as people with sight do. Okay, so they are very much innate and hardwired. They're found in all of the cultures. Now, that's not to say that there aren't cultural differences in expressions. There are. There's something called display rules. So there are social and cultural rules that regulate emotional expression, especially facial expressions. So, take a very collectivistic culture, maybe an Asian culture, Japanese or Chinese culture. The group harmony is much more important than the self. And so Chinese babies are not particularly encouraged to be emotionally expressive because that can be disruptive to group harmony. And so Chinese babies are quite a bit quieter. They cry less, they laugh less, they make fewer facial expressions than American babies do. American babies are raised in a very individualistic culture where self is thought generally to be more important than the group. And so you've already seen with babies differences in facial expressiveness, and this relates to our display rules. Okay. So let's have a little bit of fun here. Tell me what each of these expressions is. Let's start down here. This is the easiest one. So if I've got 6 basic emotions, right? So we've got joy, sadness, anger, disgust, fear, and surprise. We'll use those 6. What would this one be? That's joy, right? Joy or happiness. What's this one? Sadness. What is this one? We'll say surprise, I believe. What is this one? I'm going to say anger. This one, disgust, and this one, we'll say fear. Okay, so I'm going to show you, this is, I forget what this actor's name is. He's, I can't, it's off the top of my head. I'm going to point out some of the differences in the facial expressions. So this is sadness, drooping upper eyelids, losing focus in the eyes, and a slight pulling down of the corners of the lips. This one is happiness. You've got crow's feet. We saw that with Ekman a little bit earlier. You've got pushed up cheeks and movement from the muscle that orbits the eye. There's a muscle right here that orbits the eye, and there's movement right there. I'm sorry. No, it's out here. Yeah. All right. Surprise. Eyebrows. This, I think, is not the best illustration here. I'll go back to the other one in a minute. But the eyebrows tend to be raised, and the eyes are widened, and the mouth is open. This one is anger. The eyebrows are down and pushed together. The eyes glare, and there's a narrowing of the lips. This one is disgust. The nose wrinkles, and the upper lip is raised. And then this one is fear. Raised eyebrows, raised upper eyelids, tensed lower eyelids, and the lips slightly stretched horizontally back to the ears. So let's go back real quick to these photographs. So I'm going to point out not everything, but a few things. So anger. This one's anger. The eyebrows are pointed down, and the eyes are glaring. This one is disgust. You've got a wrinkled nose and the upper lip is open. Think about something really revolting, like think about eating a steaming pile of dog poop. Do you almost feel your lip want to curl back? Because I do. Surprise, we've got the raised eyebrows, sadness. The eyebrows are turning up here and they're down over here. That's different from the anger. And then you see it in the eyes as well. Okay, so I think this stuff is super interesting. This idea that we have all of these facial muscles and they can produce 7,000 different facial expressions, and there are 6 that are so common that they're in all of the cultures, and even babies who have never seen them will produce these. These are natural and innate. Very, very cool. So let's think about how to regulate emotions. I don't know about you, but I am almost in despair over the state of the United States and the state of emotion regulation. It seems like every other day there's some horrible story about somebody got killed because they weren't given 2 ketchups, or somebody killed their children, or somebody beat their coach with a bat, or it's on and on. It's terrifying to me personally. So let's think about how to regulate emotion. We talked about it a little bit in the human development chapter. The basic process for children is notice the emotion, recognize it as an opportunity for teaching and emotion regulation. Let the child experience the emotion, name it for them, and then let them feel it, and then begin to set some limits. So two things that tend not to work. Let's get that out of the way. Thought suppression. If you're like, oh man, I'm so upset because my boyfriend broke up with me, suppressing those thoughts is not going to work. Those thoughts are going to rebound even harder than if you had entertained the thoughts. Okay. Let me share a little story. Hannah was in fourth grade, must have been fourth grade. It was the summer before fifth grade, and we had gone to the water park, and she chain slid down a slide with some other kids, and it went all wonky and bad. They weren't supposed to have done that. She crashed into the girl in front of her teeth to the kid's head. Knocked one of her teeth out. She comes running to me. She's crying. Her tooth is hanging by like a little teeny thread. It was awful. She was so upset. I was so upset. We raced to the dentist. They shoved it in there. They put like a bar, like a tooth-colored bar across the front of her teeth. Now, and then they said, well, she could lose the tooth. The tooth could turn black and die anytime in the next year. Great. And she was going to start a new school. In just a couple of weeks. So this, and then they also said she had to wear a mouth guard at recess and PE. So starting a new school with a weird thing on your teeth and the mouth guard, and the tooth could turn black and die at any moment. This was what we were dealing with. And in addition to a lot of guilt, because she and I both know she shouldn't have done that. Okay. If Hannah had a lot of feelings about this, as did I, if we had pushed those feelings out of consciousness and tried to just ignore them, they would have rebounded back worse than if we had just experienced them. So thought suppression does not work. Rumination is also not going to be the best way to go. If we sat around constantly all day, every day thinking about this and ruminating on, oh my gosh, when is the tooth going to turn black? And how horrible it is that you have to wear the mouth guard at recess. Ruminating and thinking and perseverating on it constantly, which teenage girls tend to do in groups, prolongs the mood and makes it a habit, a mental habit. So these are two ways not to regulate emotions. Don't suppress it and don't ruminate. Instead, feel the feeling, allow yourself to feel the feeling and get it out. So every night for probably 3 or 4 months after the accident, I would tuck Hannah in bed and it would bubble up for her and she would get a little bit teary and she would want to talk about it. And so we would talk about it for 5, 10, maybe 15 minutes. And I would just empathize and let her talk and allow her that space to feel her feelings. And then when it seemed like she'd kind of gotten the emotional load out a little bit, then it was time to do what's called cognitive reappraisal. Cognitive reappraisal is where we think differently about a problem. So instead of dwelling on, oh my gosh, the tooth could turn black at any moment, we would think, you know what? What can we do to make sure that this tooth does not die? And so she and I researched together vascular health. What kinds of things should you eat for that? We researched bone health. What should you eat for that? And so I made her bone broth, homemade bone broth from either chickens or beef bones every week for a year. And she had soup or drank broth 2 or 3 days a week for a year. We made her a green smoothie almost every day for a year, because we were able to just pack so many micronutrients into those things. And so I don't know if those things helped, but certainly I do know that when we would cognitively reappraise, we would say, man, this would really stink if your tooth turned black. But here's what we can do. We can have soup. We can drink smoothies. We can see the dentist. We can pray. We can plan for what's going to happen. What will we do if it turns black? All of those are cognitive reappraisal, thinking about the situation a little bit differently. Humor. Humor allows dopamine, which is a reward neurotransmitter, serotonin, which is like a flexible, happy mood neurotransmitter, and endorphins, which are like euphoria neurotransmitters, to flow. So My husband and son and I watched The Office almost every night for about a year when they had announced it was going to go off of Netflix. We never did end up finishing it, but we watched it most nights for a year, and we would just laugh and laugh. And it released this dopamine and serotonin and endorphins and helped us to regulate emotions. And then the third one, probably less effective, but certainly is a good strategy sometimes, is distraction. Sometimes you just need to distract yourself from the problem. And so if it was, if you have to sit in the DMV for 8 hours waiting for your appointment, that's a good time to use distraction. Just distract yourself from your problem and get through it. I sometimes get impatient at the grocery store when the lines are really long, and my best bet is distraction, and I'll play on my phone a little bit. Okay, so there's some tips for you for emotion regulation. Let's think just a little bit about emotion and the brain, and then I think that's going to be the end of this chapter. So there are a few areas that are important here. The amygdala is the area in the limbic system that processes emotion and has evolved to protect us from danger. If you are a person who gets social anxiety, test anxiety, anything like that, what's happening is your amygdala is saying to you that the test is a danger. It is being overly protective of you. You probably hate your test anxiety or your social anxiety. If you can try to cognitively reappraise that and think of that as my brain is trying to help, but my brain in this case is wrong. Okay, my brain in this case is wrong. This is not going to hurt me. In fact, the anxiety is hurting me. Okay, my brain is doing its best, but my brain in this case is wrong. And I am right that the best thing to do is to go into that test, take a bunch of deep breaths, calm myself, focus on what I know, and then I'll be more successful. Okay, so this anxiety is a case of the amygdala going a little bit too far. Emotions such as fear will strengthen memories in the hippocampus. People with amygdala damage may know that something is dangerous, but they may have no physiological fear response. So that's a crazy situation. Damage in the amygdala, now they know cognitively, they know up here that it's dangerous. They saw the bad thing, they know it's dangerous, but the amygdala is damaged, and so now they don't have a fear response. Now they don't get the heart rate going up and the blood pressure and the sweaty palm, and they don't get a fight or flight going on. Okay, they will not end up behaving properly in the world. Okay, the amygdala also helps us to read other people's facial expressions, especially fear. So I'm guessing you're looking at this guy and thinking he looks a little shifty, but that she looks perfectly normal and fine. People with damage to the amygdala have a hard time reading faces. They can't read fearful faces, and they can't tell who's trustworthy and who is not. And this can cause them to approach dangerous situations because they have no fear response, and it can cause them to become overly trusting and overly friendly. So you and I are going to steer away from this guy, but a person with amygdala damage will not be afraid of him and will not recognize that he is not a trustworthy person. Okay. We also use the prefrontal cortex to regulate emotions. We understand emotions up here and we regulate emotions up here. That's this part right here. There was a patient named Elliot who had a tumor removed from the prefrontal cortex, including part of that region, and then he no longer felt any emotion at all. No emotion whatsoever. Now you might think, oh, how wonderful to be liberated from your emotion. I'll bet he was super rational. Here's the problem. He could no longer function because he reacted to problems as though they were happening to someone else. He didn't experience the emotion of a situation. It felt like it was happening to someone else, and so he couldn't cope. Sometimes people who have damage in either the prefrontal area where we do emotion or the amygdala will be unable to make simple decisions. They won't know which deodorant to pick. because they have no emotional response to it. They won't know who to make friends with and who to marry because their emotional responses are not giving them the information that they need. Remember, we started off this section saying emotion is information that's very useful to you and evolutionarily adaptive, keeps you safe. If you can't feel your emotion anymore, you end up unsafe in the world because you don't have good information. Okay. So that's the end of it. I hope you enjoyed this chapter. It was a nice short one. I thought I'd give you a little bit of a break. We'll see you again later. I wish you well.